Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Emma Marcegaglia. I'm Vice President of ISPI, and I'm very glad and honored to chair such a distinguished panel. We will discuss about some key subjects, which is securing economic stability in times of war and disruption. Let me just say a few words to introduce my outstanding panels and speaker. As we know, and also we heard this morning, the war in Gaza is taking a big toll on the MENA economies. And we know what we are witness, disruption of trade in the Red Sea, rising of indebtedness, and also uncertainty among investors are becoming more and more important and are exacerbated an already challenging economic environment in the region. This reverberation of the crisis are hitting strongly industries, the shipping sectors, the logistics sectors of countries, even not only of the region, but also far from the region, thinks about some Asian state. So with growth expected to slow, new efforts are needed to support a pathway of economic resilience, diversification, and macroeconomic reform. So there are some questions that we'll try to answer during our panel that are, how can improve synergies among international actors, local institutions, and business communities to contribute to unlock growth? How international efforts could be conveyed to strengthen the region's economic stability? And finally, also, what is the role of trade? Can we, through a fair trade, lower trade barriers, try to enhance the growth of this region? So now let me introduce my outstanding speaker here. Let's start with Edmondo Cirielli, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Italy. Welcome, Deputy Minister. Carlos Conde, Head of Middle East and Africa Division of the OECD. Welcome. Marco Hanapel, Area Vice President, Southwest Europe, Philip Morris International. Welcome, Marco. And Alia Mubayed, Founder, Association of Women Economists, MENA. Welcome. I understand that you have been here several times, so thank you and welcome again. So we will have 2 rounds of questions. And I hope, since time is not long, I ask you to stay in 5 minutes for each question. So let's start with the first round. I, of course, start with the Vice Minister, Edmondo Cirielli. So, Minister, what are the main initiatives that the Italian government is taken to restore stability and mitigate the effect of economic disruption in the main regions? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Grazie. Allora, innanzitutto, grazie a tutti gli ospiti, soprattutto gli stranieri.
Well, thank you so much. Thank to all the guests. The consequences of crisis and wars represent something that we deem extremely important. Italy is friend of the Middle East. Therefore, it is fully involved in this issue. It is important to reiterate what Minister Tajani has just said. Italy is guiding the actions aimed at restoring peace in Middle East, as well as restoring the capacity not to have hidden agendas. As a matter of fact, Italy acts as a partner that is part of the Middle East. Therefore, our action to ensure dialogue between Israel and its neighbors will be supported by several activities. In fact, we are going to act in order to release to have the hostages released. Italy has always acted in order to ensure proportional behaviors that are aimed at protecting innocent lives that shall never be included in conflicts. So we are working to ensure ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon. Italy has worked by means of the Food for Gaza and humanitarian aid for refugees. We have opened the cooperational pathway, the cooperating pathway. Italy and the other EU partners believe that the Aspides mission will stop the conflict. In fact, these terrorists operating in Yemen have jeopardized the world in several cases. Their action is now focusing on a different area. In fact, their objective is to attempt the freedom to trade. And we are paying the utmost attention to this issue. We will not respond through weapons, but Italy has to respond as its GDP is based on the trade. We are working to release the Suez Canal from this protectionist behavior. At the same time, it is extremely important to work in order to create new communication channels. We have to strengthen those that are already in place. I'm thinking about the Middle East, for example, and Africa through the Lobito corridor that already exists. We may also work to create new infrastructural corridors in these areas. This could be the way to face the issues we are dealing with at the moment. Italy has to have a short
rispetto all'approvvigionamento di materie prime e da questo punto di vista, insomma, la chiave
supply chain. Also, thanks to the raw material it has at its disposal. So we have to invest by supporting Africa, and in doing so, we will immediately respond to the current complex situation that starts from Aden Gulf and that is arriving to the Mediterranean Sea.
You really underline the role of the government in terms of peace, in terms of humanitarian support, but also in terms of enhancing economic growth, which is also very important, also to obtain peace and humanitarian work. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you in the second round. Marco, of course, here we are talking about insecurity, and economic insecurity, of course, is a question, is an issue for government, as we said, but it's also a big issue for companies. So from your perspective, how companies could deal and face this situation? How can they hedge on the old risks that we have in front of us?
Morning to all. So the first element that came already during the pandemic is the issue of global chains, of global supply chains, of global export chains. They are, of course, in a situation of instability, and for large investments, especially when you do investments that are not only targeted for one country or one region, but you're doing it for the global, you are a piece of these global chains that today are a risk for energy, are at risk for the transportation, as Vice Minister Cirielli has said, into the passage of the Suez Canal. We have strong thoughts of how the localization of some elements, of key elements of the components will evolve due to not only I mean, very strong import tax scenarios, but also on the strategic role that some regions are taking on semiconductors, on energy, on protectionism, but at the same time to control some parts of the raw materials. So when we are looking at this scenario, it is of course a scenario that went from the pandemic period to what it is today into an area where it's fundamental to find a good balance between a full globalization of the global purchasing, a full globalization of the activities that you do, at the same time to found countries that are in a stability mindset, that are looking into mid-term involvement with investments, to have a possibility to look to very large capex movements that will have a crucial role for the full development, especially in Europe. In Europe, we went from a lot of strategic thoughts in terms of how we wanted to bring Europe to a different level, but now probably some of the actions that Europe thought are into a complicated situation due to the instability of many countries that have today, that didn't have before. Germany, France, Spain, they have a difficulty that for instance, in Italy, we are, in my opinion, in a different scenario for investors, where stability of our government and a little bit of forward-looking that we never had in the last years. We see finally a country that is thinking of the midterm, that has gotten a new stature globally, and I think that the importance of Italy will also bring importance to the Mediterranean. So the role of Italy as a bridge between Europe and Africa, a bridge between Europe and the Middle East, will be crucial. As Vice Minister Cirielli said, is a role that it's happening not only geographical but also for the political items. But I still believe, and I conclude, that to produce investments, the need of a stronger Europe, of a smarter Europe in how we are thinking, it has to be done, and with the new Commission we expect a big step change. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you also for underlying the importance of striking a balance between globalization from one side, but security and stability from the other, and also the role of Italy, which now in this scenario seems more stable and can have a very important role also towards Africa. Thank you very much. Carlos Conde, so we said that the MENA region is living in a moment of several conflicts and also economic disruption that came to us, and we are living a time of instability, as we said. So I think it's very important, we heard also from the Minister before, that we need to cooperate and coordinate even further to have a stronger resilience, more resilience and more, let's say, inclusive growth. But I want also to underline that in the area, this is also a moment where some reforms are going on, and sometimes it's also important to underline it's not only war, which of course is very bad, we heard all the consequences, but this is a moment where also reforms are going on, and in some countries there are reforms to promote investments and to have a better situation. So based on your experience, what more can be done to promote more prosperity and grow in the MENA regions?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And let me, of course, start by thanking the government of Italy and the Institute for Foreign Policy for this very timely discussion. Indeed, we are in times of war and conflict, but this shouldn't hide the economic dynamics of the region. And it is very important to look closely what is happening in the countries. You were mentioning the process of reforms that is very heterogeneous, but is still very strong in most of the countries, and with a long period of consistent reforms into more competitive economies. In the OECD, we have been working closely with the countries already for 20 years, and I would like to share with you today some ideas that come from a work that is ongoing, and we are conducting with the Union for the Mediterranean on the regional integration in the Mediterranean. Already in 2021, we published a first edition of the Progress of Integration, identifying some indicators that allow to see what is the dynamics of integration or disintegration in the region. We are completing now the second edition that will be ready in 2025. And I think it's important to underline that there are strong bases to set up a policy agenda, a reform-oriented policy agenda that can have good economic impact. There are good opportunities. We are talking about economies that are sometimes much more diversified than the external perception believes, and with opportunities that with the right policies can be impactful. Let me mention 3 areas that seem particularly relevant, and some of them have already been mentioned. Investment and trade. We typically say that this is the less integrated region in the world, and it's true that in some aspects this is the case, but we can see in trade a very positive pattern which is related to the diversification of the economy. There is much more integration. We come from trade relations that were very focused in bilateral agreements between the European Union and the southern neighbors, and now we see a much more diversified. Turkey is playing a very important role across the Mediterranean. Morocco is more present. There is much important connections with Gulf countries and, of course, with Africa, to the extent that the impact of COVID has already been absorbed by the countries, and the trade has increased much more. Investment, you were mentioning, very important. The region is below potential. If we compare with other emerging economies, much more investment could come to the region. But again, very important reforms are taking place, reforming the regulations, removing restrictions, improving the quality of the institutions. And something that I'm very glad also with having the private sector in our panel, it's very important to think into the economic future of the region hand in hand with the private sector. Because at the end of the day, the investment, the creation of jobs, the innovation that can transform the economy requires a positive involvement of the private sector. We have been working recently, and I will give you just 2 examples because I think they are very telling of the potential. For example, we have been working with Jordan very closely on the digital economy. Jordan is a country with tremendous potential on the digital economy, hundreds of firms, thousands of people with very good skills that are making of Jordan a hub for digital economy. Pharmaceutical sector in Tunisia, a sector with very long tradition, very high quality, very much focused into the European markets traditionally, but now expanding its networks into Africa, and with a big potential of growth and employment. So I think these are examples that with the right policies can also provide a positive agenda for the region. It's very little time, but I would like to make 2, without elaborating, 2 aspects that are fundamental. Human capital, of course. In the region, there is a mismatch between the skills and the needs of the market. We need to invest very much on education, on the skills, on improving the human capital. And in our integration report, we see tremendous potential for the connection of the higher education systems, of the skills that are needed for the market, on the innovation and research. And of course, women. The empowerment of women and the participation of women in the economy can transform exponentially the performance of the region together, and this I stop here, of course, with the connectivity, the green transition, infrastructure, connecting the energy grids, connecting the infrastructure is also a precondition to try to build this virtuous circle of a good policy agenda that, despite the conflict, can set up more solid basis for economic development.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you to underline what still is needed in terms of education, women participation, but also underline that there are some strengths, pharmaceutical, digital, and other part which has to be strengthened, but there are some points in which we can have better results. Aliam Bayat, thank you for being here. So as we said, it's interesting, I think, to also underline that before the war, a process of kind of regional detente was begun in the Middle East with this idea that economic needs will also drive the diplomacy, because, of course, economic security and economic strength is very important. So, in your opinion and in your experience, how the war in Gaza and this ramification impacted this economic cooperation and initiative that have been launched before the war. How do you see this point?
Thank you very much for this important question. And again, thank you for being here once again for this crucial dialogue. I think the question about how Gaza is impacting these integration initiatives, be it the Abraham's Accord or the IMAC, we have two narratives actually today. One narrative that says that actually the war in Gaza and Lebanon had no impact into these agreements, and they have not changed the objectives of the countries that are pursuing further integration. And actually you can see that by the fact that none of the signatories to these agreements decided to say, okay, I'm just leaving because of the war in Gaza. We are seeing trade in goods flow continuing even after October 27. And some would say that the normalization process with Saudi Arabia is maybe delayed but not stopped. Mm-hmm. So there is this narrative that has been arguing that there is a potential for integration that has been delayed or pushed back by the war in Gaza, but that the agenda should still be here. And when I look at the number as an economist, I can exactly see that if we look at total trade between the participants, for example, of the Abraham's Accord, let's say, and Israel on the other side, we can see that overall trade has been concentrated. The drivers of this integration has been the relation between the UNE and Israel. And for example, in 2024, during the first 7 months of the year, we have seen almost 14% increase in trade. We have seen also movement of people between Israel and Morocco, Israel and UAE, Israel and Bahrain to a lesser extent. So but we have seen also that this cooperation has been very much focused on areas of defense and security issues, but also tech and agriculture. But I want to turn to the second narrative, which also argues that no, actually the war in Gaza has significantly undermined these efforts of integration, because mainly the geopolitical and domestic political landscape that should underpin these integration efforts have completely changed. And I can understand that. I can look at what's happening in the economies of Gaza and Lebanon with almost utter destruction. The UN and the World Bank have estimated 80 billion the need for reconstruction of Gaza. Let's not talk, of course, about the horrible human toll. The same in Lebanon. The World Bank has mentioned that almost as of September, the direct and indirect cost has been 8.5 billion. So the landscape, the economic landscape, at least in those two countries, had changed. But even more importantly, the spillover on the rest of the region, whether on Jordan or on Egypt, have been significant. The maritime security that Mr. Minister has mentioned with the Suez Canal disruption, the cost push inflation on the global inflation, but also undermining $8 billion of losses to Egypt. This has significantly impacted these economies and this disruption. But I think also, as we heard from the Indian minister before, the effort of pushing the agenda for example, of IMAC have now receded. He talked about an eastward IMAC. The Sherpas for IMAC have not met since September 2023. The action plan has not yet been developed. So even also the I2U2 Sherpa has not met. So these dialogues between the participants to these integration efforts have been delayed. So what I want to conclude with is to say that these two narratives exist today. They are not mutually exclusive. I think there are pros and cons and rights and wrongs in both analysis. I think the process of integration will undoubtedly be impacted by the security and the ongoing wars, and vice versa. But only time will tell to see whether these integration efforts will be indefinitely delayed, delayed for a small period, or maybe they could be transformed to take a different form.
Thank you very much. Of course, uncertainty also on that, but interesting. So let's go to the second round of questions. I ask you to be a little bit shorter than the first. So back to Deputy Minister Edmondo Cirielli. when we talk about new cooperation, I would like to ask you how you see the Mattei Plan. The Mattei Plan is a flagship initiative from the government, from the Italian government, to enhance growth and economic development. So how do you see that? How you think this has to be developed?
Grazie, cercherò di essere super breve anche
Thank
se...
you. I will try to be as short as possible, even though the topic is very complex. So let me start from the MENA region. So Middle East and North Africa, the enlarged Mediterranean. The Mattei Plan is also a translation of such plan. So it is a great initiative of our PM Meloni with Minister Tajani of Foreign Affairs, so as to provide a new framework for peer-to-peer collaboration and cooperation involving bilaterally Africa and African countries, so not only the multilateral channel of international organizations. It is a huge chance for the global gateway of the European Union and also for Arab countries of IGCC. On the other side, we know very well that the intervention in Africa overall is a crucial point, a core element for North Africa. So the sub-Saharan crisis and theaters of conflict have also put at stake our African partners. So we think that economic growth has to be strengthened with our African countries and African partners, also with Arabic Peninsula and other countries in the region. So we think it is the crucial element. It has a pivotal role to establish peace in the Middle East, as it happens with the two-state solution of Palestine and Israel. It is not, secondly, also a consequence of the strengthening of Northern African countries. So with this new paradigm of Italian cooperation, we have set forward not only the best of our companies from the public and private sector, we also started from the old world with the civil society organizations, for example, and we involved them. From a multilateral perspective, we asked for the support of UN agencies so that we can re-establish our intervention in Africa, not only with a co-decision process and co-participation process with African countries. So we finance UN agencies in Africa, and if actually they have a stance in Africa, we cannot get to somebody else home and say what they have to do. It seems something taken for granted, but lately we have forgotten that. Despite the huge amounts of flows, the huge amounts of money going to Africa, the Western world has always been financing 19% of the African continent. We have to realize and to acknowledge that we had no results. Stabilization in Africa is crucial for Europe, for the Arabic Peninsula, and for Europe in general, for Italy especially. Africa is not only a challenge, but is also a great opportunity. 60% of arable lands in the planet are located in Africa. 60% of energy resources from gas and renewable energies are in Africa. 60% of rare earths are in Africa. So Africa is a wealthy country and it also has a huge human capital. This is why we aim to education, training, not only in agriculture and food security, with an initiative that can be an historical moment because it will give back security, food security, not only in Northern Africa, but also the rest of Africa, and hence for Europe, in order to establish their food sovereignty. All of this can be done in full cooperation with European institutions and Arab countries that are gathered in the Gulf Cooperation countries. We also have to work relentlessly so that youngsters in Africa can have a prosperous future. We are investing on businesses and new technologies so that from Africa they can contribute hugely to the stability of the region. So if Africa grows, Italy grows, Middle East grows, and vice versa. If things were not to turn for the good, all the stability and the economy is at stake, besides also global stability and security.
Interesting way to make cooperation with a great joint venture between public and private and with real concrete projects, and as you said, not only on energy but also on health, on agriculture, or on all the other parts. So let's hope, but we are sure that with concrete projects this will have a very interesting outcome. Marco, very shortly, we already talked about international trade, and you also said that this is very important, but we are living in a situation where we are in a kind of deglobalization, a lot of protectionism, tariffs. So in your opinion and in your experience, is there still a place for fair trade to enhance growth also in the MENA region?
We think so, and I actually think that there are bridges that have been built in the past from the MENA region, from the Mediterranean region, from Italy, versus partners in trade, also in common ground on many aspects, including some views of the world. That should continue. One example, for instance, is the use of bilateral agreements outside the European Union, for instance, with Japan, or with Saudi Arabia, or we have possibility to create these bridges outside of Europe, with possibilities to do what Italy is good, which is exporting, but at the same time to really create a stability of flow of materials and export that can go beyond the actual activities. The other important part, for instance, is with Mercosur, where we are also now having more ties, more strong bonds in order to also leverage the vicinity that we have also to that kind of region. So these bilateral agreements beyond the European Union are, in my opinion, very, very important.
Thank you very much, Mark. I agree with you. I think we have to keep an eye on trade and fair trade, otherwise, our growth will not be strong. Alia, we already talked about the fact that we are living in a situation where, the war from one side is impacting on the economy, but on the other side, integration is anywhere there. So in your opinion, what kind of reforms should be done and adopted to encourage the private sector investment and the financial development?
Yeah, I mean, today we all know that the MENA region is one of the least integrated in terms of trade. And I mean, just to give you a number, it only represents 7.5% of total trade in the world. And even worse is really the very low level of intra-regional trade. So the reform agenda for private sector has to be built around, I think, obviously, three broad pillars. The first pillar has to go back to the issue of war with bringing back stability, right? Because no private investor will come to the region without seeing risk premia significantly go down. We are seeing the cost of insurance on companies trading through the Suez Canal, but also the cost of borrowing of companies that are based in the region is exposed. So getting stability and ceasefires and path to stability is key. Second is the reform. And in the reforms, there are the trade policy reforms. This is a region where both tariffs and non-tariff barriers are among the highest in the world, and we need to bring these down. The cost of logistic is also relatively elevated, except in the GCC. So bringing infrastructure back to the level that help reduces trading costs is extremely important. All the regulatory reform, most important of which is reducing all the licensing necessary for private sector, whether it's domestic or international, to access the market is important. And this is all the sort of state-owned enterprises reform agenda, because many of the economies, including in the Gulf countries, are dominated by government or government-related entities. And now the Gulf countries have gone a long way in terms of putting a lot of solid corporate governance, and now we are seeing starting IPOing a lot of these companies. We have to see the same in the non-GC countries, particularly in Egypt, in Tunisia. And I think the last one is really about human capital, because I think, and we heard it before, this is a region where educational level, particularly now after the war, this is the area that will suffer the most.
Yeah.
And I think we need to continue with our partners, both in the public and the private sector, invest in not only bringing back people to school, but also making sure that they are skilled enough to face basically the next generation of work skill that is required.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we are out of time, so I really ask you to be very short. Of course, as OECD, you work a lot on cooperation with a lot of also fragile economies, and do it the same also with the MENA countries. So what are some concrete examples of OECD support to MENA countries that are affected by war and fragility, and how you think this situation can get better?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, we normally think in the impact of the conflict in some countries over the other countries, but we need also to reflect in what are the internal conditions, economic conditions of these countries, not only in terms of humanitarian disaster and health, but also, let's not forget that in countries, especially where the institutions of the government are weak or have been destroyed, again, the role of the private sector, you have companies, you have small and medium enterprises that are delivering goods and services. It's important to look into that. The Putin minister was mentioning the importance of Africa, where in Africa most of the countries can be categorized as fragile. We need to better understand what are the economic dynamics and how to better contribute to destabilization. One example that is very close is Libya. Libya is, of course, a space that is very central for the Mediterranean. After years of instability, is still a matter of concern for the Mediterranean. We have been working for the last years, and now we are launching a new initiative thanks to the support of the government of Italy, and our work is concentrated on working with the private sector to better measure what are the different sectors that have a potential, what is the economic structure, what are the challenges in terms of access to finance, access to markets, the skill, the necessary regulations. We have been working, for example, with the banking system, with the digital, with the agro-food. And in all these cases, we are also working in Yemen and other countries. There is always important thinking in the conditions of reconstruction since the very beginning. You cannot just live for the political solution, paying economic attention to the situation of the countries. On the contrary, trying to build stronger economic conditions can be an important contribution to the peace.
Thank you very much. So thank you to our speakers. I hope you find it interesting. We'll try to go a little bit deeper in how to enhance growth, with also some concrete examples of reforms, of projects that are going on. So also in this situation of uncertainty and war, some lights are there. We have, all of us have to work to really support and strengthen everything that can make the growth stronger, because growth means also better peace and better humanitarian peace. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the panel.
Ciao, non vi preoccupate, vi seguo.
Grazie Vice Ministro.